Spring 1942. The North Atlantic, somewhere west of the Bay of Biscay. Kapitän-Leutnant Rolf Mitzelberg, 28 years old, stood in the conning tower of U-203 and watched the horizon. He had sunk 19 ships in the past year. He was one of the most decorated U-boat commanders in the Kriegsmarine. He wore the Knight's Cross at his throat. His crew called him the Ace. His superiors called him irreplaceable. His boat had been at sea for 11 days. They had received 3 encrypted radio messages from BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, the U-boat command in Lorient, France. The messages were detailed: grid coordinates, convoy routes, fuel estimates, the positions of other wolves in the pack. The messages told him where to go, where to wait, where to strike. He did not question the messages. Nobody did. The thing that nobody at U-boat command understood in the spring of 1942, and that nobody would allow themselves to understand for another 2 years, every time BDU broadcast one of those encrypted radio messages, it was not just reaching Mitzelberg. It was reaching the British Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Centre in London. It was reaching the American codebreakers at OP-20G in Washington, and it was reaching the escort commanders on the surface above, who were already calculating an intercept course. The wolves were hunting, and someone was hunting the wolves. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who built the U-boat arm from 23 operational submarines in 1939 to over 300 by 1942, would spend the better part of 2 years refusing to believe what the numbers were telling him. When his boats vanished, he blamed traitors. When his grid coordinates were compromised, he blamed spies at the French ports. When entire wolf packs were intercepted before they could close on a convoy, he blamed the British radar. He commissioned security investigations. He interrogated his own officers. He fired staff members. He redesigned his cipher procedures. He never once, in those 2 years, seriously entertained the simplest explanation. They were reading his mail. To understand how Dönitz built a communication system so sophisticated that it became the instrument of his own destruction, and why the man who prided himself on controlling his fleet with mathematical precision refused to see the answer that was hiding in plain sight, we need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the war, the beginning of the radio. Part 1. The Iron Leash. To understand what Dönitz built, you have to understand what he believed. Karl Dönitz was born in Grunau, near Berlin, in the year 1991. No, hold that. He was born on the 16th of September 1891, the son of an optical engineer. He joined the Imperial Navy at the age of 18. He served in surface ships, then transferred to the submarine arm in 1916, and was captured by the British in October of 1918, when his submarine, UB-68, surfaced after mechanical failure off Sicily. He spent the last months of the war in a British prisoner of war camp, and he had a great deal of time to think. What he thought about, obsessively, was the problem of coordinated attack. The U-boats of the First World War had operated as individual hunters. Each commander found his own prey, made his own decisions, fought his own battles. The result was a campaign that nearly strangled Britain, but failed. The introduction of the convoy system in 1917 had changed everything. Lone submarines could not reliably find and attack convoys that were being routed around known patrol areas. The mathematics were straightforward. A convoy of 40 ships occupied roughly the same area of ocean as a single ship. If you didn't know where the convoy was, you might miss it entirely. If you did know, one submarine was not enough to break through the escort screen. Dönitz's solution, developed through the 1920s and early 30s in theoretical papers and then in fleet exercises, was the Rudel tactic, the wolf pack. The idea was simple: use radio to concentrate multiple submarines against a single convoy simultaneously. A lone boat that spotted a convoy would not attack immediately. It would shadow the convoy, broadcasting position reports by radio back to BDU. BDU would then vector all available submarines in the area onto the convoy's track. When enough boats were in position, 5, 8, 12, they would attack together, overwhelming the escort screen with simultaneous torpedo attacks from multiple directions. The radio was the iron leash that made this possible. Without radio, the boats were autonomous hunters, each operating on its own initiative. With radio, they became a coordinated weapon system, responsive to central command, capable of massing force against a point of weakness with a precision that no previous submarine campaign had achieved. Dönitz did not invent radio-controlled naval tactics, but he built the most sophisticated implementation of them that any navy had yet attempted, and he built it around a cipher machine that he believed, with complete sincerity, until very late in the war, was unbreakable. The machine was the Enigma, specifically the Naval Enigma, designated M3 in its early form and upgraded to M4, a 4-rotor version, in February of 1942. The Naval Enigma was more complex than the Army or Air Force versions. It had additional rotors, additional plugboard settings, and a separate cipher procedure for U-boat communications called the Schlüssel-M system. Naval cryptographers at the OKM, the German Naval High Command, were confident that the number of possible settings exceeded 158 quintillion. They calculated that even if the British captured an Enigma machine with all its rotors, they would still need to know the daily key settings to read any message, and the key settings changed every 24 hours. Dönitz trusted the machine absolutely. This is not a criticism of his intelligence. The faith was rational given what he knew. What he did not know, could not know, because the British protected the secret with extraordinary ferocity, was that a team of mathematicians at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, led initially by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, had broken the naval enigma. Not perfectly, not always, not instantly, but often enough and quickly enough to matter. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before the code breakers became the decisive factor, there was something else. Something that Dönitz had built into his system from the very beginning that made his fleet vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with cipher mathematics. He had built a system that required his submarines to transmit constantly. Think about that for a moment. A submarine's greatest advantage is invisibility. It cannot be seen. It cannot easily be detected. It can slip beneath the surface and become, in effect, non-existent to the enemy. Every second it spends submerged, transmitting nothing, it is essentially invulnerable to surface and air attack. But a submarine that is transmitting radio signals is not invisible. It is announcing its presence to anyone with a receiver and a direction-finding antenna. And by 1940, the British had both. The system was called HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding, known to everyone who used it as HFDUF. The principle was simple. Radio waves travel in straight lines from their source. If you have two or more receiving stations in different locations, and they both detect the same transmission, you can triangulate the transmitter's position by measuring the angle of arrival of the signal at each station. The more receiving stations you have, the more precise the fix. The British had been developing shipborne HF/DF since the late 1930s. By 1942, many convoy escort vessels were equipped with it. A U-boat that transmitted a position report, even briefly, could be fixed to within 30 to 50 miles by shore-based stations and to within 5 to 10 miles by a ship close enough to receive the signal at a useful angle. That was close enough to vector an aircraft or a destroyer to the U-boat's position. Dönitz knew that direction finding existed. He had known since the First World War. His response was to instruct his commanders to keep transmissions short, ideally under 30 seconds, and to submerge immediately after transmitting. What he did not fully appreciate until very late was how precise the British direction-finding network had become, or how many escort ships were carrying shipborne sets. He calculated that short transmissions were essentially safe. He was wrong by a margin that cost him hundreds of boats and thousands of men. But direction finding was only the first vulnerability. The second was the cipher itself. Part 2. The House of Cards. Meet Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke, 33 years old in 1942, born in Rotha, Saxony, the son of a schoolteacher. He had been a merchant marine officer before the war, which meant he understood ship handling at a level that pure naval officers sometimes lacked. He commanded U-515, a Type 9C boat, 752 tons surface displacement with a range of 13,500 nautical miles at 10 knots. He was precise, aggressive, and methodical. His crew trusted him with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from watching a man make the right decision under pressure, repeatedly over months at sea. In March of 1943, Henke was operating in the Central Atlantic. He had received a series of radio messages from BDU, routing instructions, convoy coordinates, weather reports. He had followed them to the letter, and he had found the convoys, sunk ships, and survived. But something was bothering him. In his war diary, the Kriegstagebuch, the KTB, which every U-boat commander was required to maintain, and which was transmitted to BDU after each patrol, Henke noted, in his characteristically precise handwriting, that on 3 separate occasions during his patrol, aircraft had appeared within minutes of his boat surfacing to transmit a position report. Not hours, minutes. He noted the times, he noted the bearings, he noted his transmission times and compared them to the aircraft's arrival vectors. He did not draw the obvious conclusion in writing. He was a careful man, but the data was there, in the KTB, for anyone who wanted to read it. Nobody at BDU wanted to read it. Not that way. The architecture of the problem, laid out as clearly as the documents allow, is this. The naval Enigma M3 cipher, which protected U-boat communications from the beginning of the war through February of 1942, was broken by Bletchley Park with increasing reliability from the summer of 1941 onward. The breakthrough came partly from theoretical mathematics, Turing's bomb machines, which could test Enigma key settings at mechanical speed, and partly from captured material. In May of 1941, HMS Bulldog, commanded by Commander A.J. Baker Creswell, captured U-110 in the North Atlantic. The boarding party, led by Sub-Lieutenant David Baum, 20 years old, from Kensington, London, a former student at Dartmouth Naval College, recovered the Enigma machine, its rotors, and, critically, the current key settings and the cipher officer's codebook. Baum went down the conning tower of a sinking submarine, alone, without knowing whether anyone was still aboard, and brought back the material that allowed Bletchley Park to read naval Enigma traffic for the next several weeks, while the Germans remained unaware that the machine had been compromised. Astanavis. Think about what that meant. Think about what Baum was doing, at 20 years old, climbing down into a flooding enemy submarine that could have had armed men waiting, or could have sunk at any moment. He spent approximately 12 minutes below the waterline recovering documents and equipment. He did not know what he had. He knew it was important. He brought it up. The Germans changed their key settings regularly as planned. But the captures and the mathematical work at Bletchley Park kept pace often enough that British naval intelligence was reading a significant proportion of U-boat traffic through 1941 and into early 1942 with varying delays, sometimes within hours, sometimes within days. Then, in February of 1942, the Germans introduced the 4-rotor M4 Enigma for U-boat communications, and Bletchley went dark. For 10 months, from February to December of 1942, the U-boat cipher was unreadable. These were the darkest months of the Battle of the Atlantic for the Allies. The U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in 1942. The convoy routing intelligence that had allowed the Admiralty to steer convoys away from wolf packs was gone. The U-boats were, for those 10 months, effectively blind to British code reading. And they made the Allies pay for it. But even during those 10 months, HF/DF was still working, direction finding was still working, and the operational patterns of the Wolfpack system were still providing information that trained analysts could use. Here is what the Allies could do even when they couldn't read the cipher. They could detect that a U-boat was transmitting. They could fix its position to within a useful margin. They could observe which convoys were attacked and which were not. And they could begin to construct a picture of U-boat patrol zones. They could note that certain grid squares, the German naval grid used a system of letter-number designations covering the entire Atlantic, were consistently associated with U-boat activity. And they could route convoys around them. They could not read the messages, but they could read the behavior. And the behavior was remarkably consistent, because Dönitz required it to be. His control system demanded that U-boats report their positions regularly. It demanded that they report contact with convoys immediately. It demanded that shadowing boats maintain contact and broadcast regular position updates. Every one of these transmissions was a lighthouse flash in the radio spectrum. Brief, yes, but detectable, fixable, actionable. Dönitz had built a system of extraordinary operational sophistication. He could move submarines across millions of square miles of ocean with the precision of a chess player. He knew where every boat was. He knew what every boat had sunk. He could mass force against the target with a speed and coordination that no previous submarine campaign had achieved. And every single one of these capabilities depended on his submarines talking to him constantly. He had built a radio-dependent weapon system, and radio in 1942 was a two-way street. By December of 1942, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had broken the four-rotor M4 Enigma. The break came through a combination of captured material, particularly from weather ships, which used simpler cipher procedures that provided cribs, known plaintext fragments, that could be used to attack the main cipher, and a theoretical advance by mathematician Alan Turing that allowed the bomb machines to handle the additional rotor. From December of 1942 onward, naval Enigma traffic was being read again, often within hours of transmission, and the intelligence, designated Ultra, began flowing to convoy commanders and escort groups with results that became statistically unmistakable within weeks. The turn came in May of 1943. In that month alone, the U-boats lost 41 submarines. In April, they had lost 15. In March, they had lost 15. The acceleration was not random. It was not improved radar alone, though radar improved. It was not more aircraft, though there were more aircraft. It was the combination. Ultra-intelligence routing convoys away from wolf packs while simultaneously vectoring hunter-killer groups onto U-boat positions. Supported by HF/DF on the escort vessels, supported by longer-range aircraft now capable of covering the mid-Atlantic air gap. The system that Dönitz had built to control his fleet was now, systematically, killing it. And Dönitz did not understand why. If you are going to understand what happened next, what Dönitz did with the mounting evidence, and why he interpreted it the way he did, you need to understand something about the man's character. He was not stupid. He was not delusional. He was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most capable naval commanders of the war. His tactical thinking was creative and rigorous. His logistical management of the U-boat arm was impressive. His personal courage was unquestioned. But he had built the Wolfpack system himself. It was his creation, his doctrine, his life's work. And he had built it on two foundations that he believed were unassailable: the operational superiority of the coordinated attack and the cryptographic security of the Enigma cipher. To accept that the cipher was broken was not just to accept a technical failure. It was to accept that his entire command system, the iron leash, the radio net, the beautiful machine of coordinated destruction that he had spent 2 decades building, had been turned against him. That every order he had issued, every position he had assigned, every convoy track he had calculated and transmitted, had been read by his enemies. That was not a conclusion a man like Dönitz reached easily. If you can understand that, you can understand everything that follows. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what the Battle of the Atlantic actually looked like, not the version that survived in the official histories, but the version that was playing out in the cipher rooms and the radio shacks and the KTBs that the commanders wrote when they thought they were only writing for the record, press the like button. It helps keep this kind of work visible, and it matters. Part 3. The Traitor Hunt. The losses in May of 1943 were catastrophic. 41 boats in 31 days. Dönitz withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic on the 24th of May. He described it in his war diary as a temporary withdrawal. He called May Black May, Schwarzer Mai, in his memoirs written after the war. He acknowledged the scale of the disaster. What he did not acknowledge, even in memoirs written with the benefit of hindsight and access to the post-war historical record, was what had actually caused it. In the immediate aftermath of Black May, Dönitz and his staff at BDU, now relocated from Lorient to Berlin and then to Paris, conducted what amounted to a systematic search for traitors. The logic was straightforward, and it was wrong. If the Allies were intercepting wolf packs with this precision, they must have advance information. Advance information could only come from two sources. Either someone was betraying operational plans, or the Enigma cipher was broken. The cipher experts at the OKM, the Naval High Command, reviewed the Enigma system and declared it secure. This was not dishonest. The analysis was technically sound given what they knew. The number of possible key settings was astronomical. The procedures for changing settings were rigorous. The machines themselves showed no signs of having been compromised. The experts concluded that the Enigma was not the source of the leaks, which left the traitors. The security investigations that followed were extensive. Port security at Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire and La Pallice was reviewed. Shore staff with access to operational orders were investigated. Communications procedures were audited. The BDU operations staff, the men who drafted the radio messages that were encrypted and transmitted to the boats, were subjected to security reviews. Several individuals were transferred or dismissed on the basis of suspicion. None were ever found to have betrayed operational secrets, because none had. But here is what makes the traitor hunt so revealing and so tragic. In the process of investigating the security of their communications, the German naval staff came within touching distance of the real answer, several times. In the summer of 1943, a German signals intelligence unit, the B-Dienst, the Beobachtungsdienst, the Naval Observation Service, produced a report noting that Allied convoy routing changes appeared to correlate with U-boat radio transmissions. The B-Dienst had been reading Allied naval codes with considerable success since the early years of the war, a fact that is often overlooked in histories of the Atlantic campaign, and their analysts were sophisticated enough to notice patterns. The report suggested that Allied convoy rerouting was happening too quickly to be explained by aerial reconnaissance alone, and that the timing suggested foreknowledge of U-boat positions. The report was reviewed at BDU. The conclusion drawn was that Allied radio direction finding was more effective than previously estimated. This was correct, as far as it went. HF/DF was indeed providing position information that was being used to route convoys, but it was not the whole answer. The report did not suggest, or if it suggested, the suggestion was not acted upon, that the cipher itself might be compromised. A second near miss came in the fall of 1943. An officer at the OKM cipher section, his name does not appear clearly in the surviving documents, and I will not assign a name to him, wrote an internal memorandum suggesting that the mathematical security of the Enigma, while theoretically sound, might not translate into practical security if the Allies had captured sufficient material to establish the key settings. The memorandum was reviewed, it was filed, it was not acted upon in any operationally significant way. The Germans were standing at the open door of the answer. They could see the room, they did not walk in. Why? The answer, as best as the historical record allows us to reconstruct it, is a combination of institutional factors that would be familiar to any student of organizational failure. First, the cipher experts had staked their professional credibility on the security of the Enigma. Admitting that it was broken would require admitting that they had been wrong, catastrophically, fatally wrong, for potentially years. The institutional pressure against that conclusion was enormous. Second, the Germans had a competing explanation that was plausible, partially correct, and psychologically much easier to accept. Allied radar had improved dramatically, Allied aircraft ranges had increased, Allied anti-submarine doctrine had improved, Allied escort groups were better trained and better equipped. All of this was true. All of it contributed to the rising losses. It was possible, it was even reasonable, to attribute the losses to these factors alone, without invoking cipher compromise. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Germans had a fundamentally incorrect mental model of what cipher security meant. They thought of the enigma as either broken or unbroken, a binary state. The reality at Bletchley Park was more complex. The cipher was broken intermittently, with varying delays, across different traffic categories. Some messages were read within hours, some were read days later, too late to be operationally useful, some were never read at all. The intelligence product was not a clean, complete picture of German operations. It was a mosaic, patchy and inconsistent, that required skilled interpretation to be useful. The Germans, looking for evidence of systematic cipher compromise, did not find the clean pattern they expected because there was no clean pattern. There was a mosaic. And they didn't know they were looking for a mosaic. Dönitz, in his post-war memoir 10 Years and 20 Days, 10 Jahre und 20 Tage, written in the early 1950s, addressed the question of the cipher with a passage that is worth examining carefully. He wrote that after the war, he had been informed that the British had broken the enigma and that this had contributed to the U-boat losses. He expressed surprise. He maintained that during the war, his cipher experts had assured him the machine was secure and that he had had no reason to doubt them. He wrote, "Had I known that the enemy was reading our ciphers, I would have changed the system immediately." That sentence is the key to understanding Dönitz. He was not lying. He genuinely believed during the war that the cipher was secure. His cipher experts had told him so. He had trusted them. And the institutional machinery of the Kriegsmarine and the OKM had consistently produced analyses that supported that conclusion. But had no reason to doubt is not entirely accurate. There were reasons. Werner Henke's KTB entries about aircraft arriving minutes after transmissions were reasons. The B-Dienst report about Allied routing changes was a reason. The near-miss internal memorandum was a reason. The sheer statistical improbability of the Allied interception rates, given what was known about radar ranges and aircraft patrol patterns, was a reason. The reasons were there. They were filed, reviewed, and set aside. Hold that thought. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. The forensic verdict of this investigation is the following. Karl Dönitz did not lose the Battle of the Atlantic because of traitors. He lost it because he built a command system whose operational sophistication was inseparable from its cryptographic vulnerability, and because the institutional culture of the Kriegsmarine's cipher establishment made it psychologically and professionally impossible for anyone to deliver the accurate diagnosis until it was too late to matter. Let's take each element in turn. The Wolfpack system, as Dönitz designed it, required constant radio communication. This was not a design flaw in the conventional sense. It was a deliberate and rational trade-off. The alternative, autonomous submarine operations without central coordination, had been tried in the First World War and found insufficient against the convoy system. The radio net was what made the Wolfpack operationally superior to the lone hunter. You cannot have the Wolfpack without the radio, and you cannot have the radio without the transmission, and you cannot have the transmission without the direction-finding vulnerability. Dönitz understood this trade-off. He accepted it. He mitigated it by requiring short transmissions and immediate submergence. What he did not, could not, fully account for was the rate of improvement in Allied direction-finding technology and the density of HF/DF equipped escorts by 1942 and 1943. By the time the escort groups were equipped with shipborne Huff-Duff sets, a U-boat transmitting a 30-second position report was giving away its position to potentially multiple receivers simultaneously. The mitigation was insufficient. The trade-off had shifted against him. The cipher failure was the second layer, and here the story becomes more complex. Because the cipher failure was not simply a matter of British mathematical genius defeating German cryptographic design. It was a systemic failure of German operational security that the cipher was designed to protect against. Consider the sheer volume of U-boat radio traffic. In a single month of active North Atlantic operations, the U-boat arm might transmit several thousand encrypted messages, position reports, contact reports, weather reports, convoy sighting reports, fuel and ammunition status reports, requests for orders, acknowledgements of orders, situation reports, and the routine administrative traffic of a large military organization at sea. Each of these transmissions was a data point. Each one was an opportunity for codebreakers to find cribs, known or guessed plaintext fragments that could be used to attack the cipher. The Germans knew that traffic volume was a cryptographic vulnerability. Their cipher procedures included instructions to minimize unnecessary transmissions. But the operational requirements of the Wolfpack system generated irreducible minimum traffic levels that were, in practice, very high. A shadowing boat reporting a convoy's position had to transmit. A boat that had made contact had to transmit. A boat requesting a grid assignment had to transmit. The system could not function with less traffic. And more traffic meant more cribs. More cribs meant faster cipher breaking. The Allies understood this. Bletchley Park's codebreakers actively exploited the predictability of German naval message formats. Weather reports from U-boats followed a standard format that included predictable phrases in predictable positions, phrases that could be used as cribs to attack the day's key settings. The German practice of acknowledging orders with a standard confirmation message provided another crib source. Even the routine practice of transmitting a boat's identification number at the beginning of each message provided structural information that the bomb machines could exploit. The Germans were not unaware of these vulnerabilities in principle. Their cipher procedures were designed to minimize them. But the operational requirements of the Wolfpack system, combined with the institutional culture that prioritized operational efficiency over cryptographic caution, meant that the procedures were frequently abbreviated or bypassed under operational pressure. Now, the traitor hunt. The security investigations of 1943 were not simply futile, they were actively harmful, in two ways. First, they consumed time and institutional energy that might otherwise have been directed toward a genuine analysis of the cipher vulnerability. Every week that BDU staff spent reviewing port security at Lorient was a week not spent on a rigorous statistical analysis of whether Allied interception rates were consistent with direction finding alone or required an additional intelligence source. Second, and more insidiously, the traitor hunt created a false sense of resolution. When the investigations found no traitors, which they couldn't because there were no traitors, the implicit conclusion was that the security problem had been investigated and no systemic compromise had been found. This made it harder, not easier, to raise the cipher question again. The investigation had, in effect, cleared the cipher. Dönitz was not the only senior officer who failed to recognize the cipher compromise. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, never raised the question in terms that reached Dönitz's level. The OKM cipher section, as noted, reviewed the enigma and cleared it. The BDU operations staff, who drafted the messages and watched the boats fail to return, drew their conclusions from the available evidence and reached the wrong answer. This is not a story about one man's failure. It is a story about an institutional failure so complete that no individual within the institution had both the information and the authority to correct it. Let's look at the numbers. In the first 3 years of the war, September of 1939 through August of 1942, the U-boats sank approximately 11.7 million tons of Allied shipping. They lost 216 submarines in the same period. The exchange rate was roughly 54,000 tons of shipping per submarine lost. Brutal for the Allies. Sustainable, barely, for the Germans. In the last 2 years of the war, from the beginning of 1943 through May of 1945, the U-boats sank approximately 4.8 million tons of Allied shipping. They lost 559 submarines. The exchange rate had fallen to roughly 8,600 tons per submarine lost. The campaign had ceased to be sustainable in March of 1943. By May of 1943, it had ceased to be rational. Count those numbers yourself: 216 submarines in 3 years, 559 in 2 years. The acceleration is not a gradual trend, it is a cliff edge. Something changed in early 1943, and it changed fast, and it changed completely. That something was the restoration of full ultra-intelligence coverage after the M4 break, combined with the maturation of shipborne HF/DF, combined with the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap by very long-range Liberator aircraft. These 3 factors did not each contribute equally. Ultra was the foundation. Without Ultra, the routing intelligence that kept convoys away from wolf packs was unavailable. Without routing intelligence, the convoys ran into the wolf packs. With routing intelligence, the wolf packs chased empty ocean, while hunter-killer groups, vectored by HF/DF and guided by Ultra, found the submarines. The system Dönitz had built to hunt convoys had been turned into a system for hunting submarines. Now let's return to the men. Rolf Mützelberg, the ace who stood in the conning tower of U-203 in the spring of 1942, was dead before Black May. He was killed on the 11th of September 1942, not by Allied action, but by accident. He dived from the deck of his submarine for a swim during a calm spell in the Atlantic, struck the water badly, and died of his injuries. He was 28 years old. He had sunk 26 ships, totaling approximately 111,500 tons. He was awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross posthumously. He is buried at the German Naval Cemetery at Kiel-Lebeau. Werner Henke, the careful man from Rother who noticed the aircraft arriving minutes after his transmissions, was captured in April of 1944, when U-515 was sunk in the Atlantic by aircraft from the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. He was taken to the United States to Fort Hunt Prisoner of War Interrogation Center in Virginia, where American intelligence officers attempted to extract information from him. He refused to cooperate. On the 4th of June 1944, 2 days before the Normandy landings, he was shot and killed while attempting to climb the perimeter fence of the camp. He was 35 years old. Whether the attempt was a genuine escape bid or a deliberate choice to die rather than continue as a prisoner is not known with certainty. He is buried at the German military cemetery at Fort Meade, Maryland. David Baum, the 20-year-old sub-lieutenant who climbed into the sinking U-110 and brought back the Enigma material, survived the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He continued his naval career, eventually retiring as a commander. He gave interviews about the boarding of U-110 throughout his later life, always careful to note that he had not known at the time the full significance of what he was recovering. He died in 2016 at the age of 95. Karl Dönitz survived the war to become, briefly, the last head of the German state. Hitler named him his successor in his final testament, and Dönitz served as Reich president for 23 days in May of 1945, before surrendering to the Allies. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes and crimes against peace, and sentenced to 10 years in Spandau prison. He served the full sentence and was released in 1956. He spent his remaining years writing and defending the reputation of the U-boat arm. He died in December of 1980 at the age of 89 in Almühle near Hamburg, the last surviving Grand Admiral of the German Navy. In his memoirs, in his interviews, in his public statements over the decades after the war, Dönitz returned again and again to the cipher question. He expressed consistently the same position. He had been told the cipher was secure. He had had no reason to believe otherwise. He had trusted his experts. He was telling the truth. And the truth was not enough. The final irony is precise enough to be worth stating carefully. Dönitz built the Wolfpack system because he understood, better than almost anyone in the German Navy, the mathematical logic of coordinated attack. He understood that concentration of force against a dispersed target was the fundamental principle of naval warfare. He understood that radio communication was the mechanism that made concentration possible across the vast distances of the Atlantic. He built a command system of remarkable elegance, precisely calibrated to the operational requirements of submarine warfare. And then he ran it in a radio environment where his enemies could read his transmissions, fix his boat's positions, and use the very coordination signals he was sending to mass their own forces against his submarines. He used the logic of concentration against himself. The Wolfpack, in the end, worked exactly as designed. It concentrated force against the target. The target, it turned out, was not the convoys. It was the U-boats. Dönitz stood in the operations room in Paris in the summer of 1943, moving markers across the Atlantic chart, calculating intercept vectors and patrol zones and convoy tracks, issuing orders that travelled through the Enigma machine and out into the radio spectrum and across the ocean to his commanders. He was doing exactly what he had designed the system to do. The system was working perfectly. The system was killing his men. He never stopped trusting it. He never stopped transmitting. He never stopped believing that the next Wolfpack, the next coordinated attack, the next perfectly timed convergence of submarines on a convoy track would turn the tide. The tide had already turned. It had turned in the cipher rooms at Bletchley Park, in the HF/DF shacks on the escort destroyers, in the operations rooms at the Admiralty, where the ultra-intelligence was translated into routing orders that the convoy commanders never questioned and never explained. The U-boat men did not know they were being hunted. They thought they were hunting. That gap between what they believed and what was true is where 783 German submarines went to the bottom of the Atlantic between 1939 and 1945. 30,000 men out of 41,000 who served. The highest casualty rate of any branch of any military force in the Second World War. Press the like button if this investigation gave you something the textbooks didn't. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember this, the most dangerous intelligence failure is not the one where you don't have the information. It is the one where you have it, file it, and walk away from the open door. Dönitz stood at that door for 2 years. He never walked through.